This is a story about the moon. I love the moon, so I love to tell stories about the moon. Now, there once was a place in the eastern part of Britain where all the people in that village loved the moon. Now, that village sat on high ground, but all around it were bogs, very, very wet and very treacherous. You had to watch where you stepped, because if you stepped where there was quaking grass, you might get sucked under, and no one would ever see you again. Well, you could be careful during the day, but at night you couldn't see very well in front of you at all. And not only that, but the bogs were full of evil horrors, witches and bogles, the ghosts of those who had died there, the dead hand that would reach up from the pool and pull you under, and will-o'-the-wisps that looked friendly, but they would lead you right off the path until you were hopelessly lost. So, when the moon shone, all of those evil things, those creeping horrors, they were afraid of the light, and they would go back into their hidey holes. So the people loved the moon. Well, one night, towards the end of the month, the moon decided to see for herself what was happening in the boglands. And so, first of all, she wrapped herself in a cloak to hide all of her shining self and her glittering hair. And then she came right down to earth. The only light that showed was from her feet. And maybe that's why she tripped on a stone. Now, all of those creeping things, they were watching and waiting to see what she would do and whether they could capture her. And when she tripped, she reached out for a branch, a snag that stuck up from the rotting moss. She held tight, and that snag sent out 2 tendrils to wrap around her wrists like handcuffs. She couldn't move. She was stuck fast, and she struggled to be free. And then she heard a voice, "Wait! Wait for me! I'm coming! Just stop and wait for me!" And she looked over, and there was old Matthew, lost in the bog and following a will-o'-the-wisp. He must have thought it was the lantern of someone who knew their way out, but he would certainly be lost in the bog if she didn't help him. And so she struggled even harder and managed to get the hood off of her head. And when she did, a bolt of light shot across the bog, and old Matty, he saw the path. Oh, there it is. And he stumbled his way home. Well, after she had struggled so hard, the moon was tired, and the hood fell back over her face, and it was dark. And so all of those creeping things, they came right up to her and laid their hands, those who had them, on her and held her fast. And then they argued, what shall we do with her? How shall we destroy her? Well, they argued so long that the light began to show in the east. They had to do something. So they pushed her into a cold, shallow pool, and the Bogles brought a long, flat stone to cover her from the top to the bottom. There was a snag at the head of that stone, and that snag had branches, and they took one of the will-o'-the-wisps and they stuck it in those branches to keep watch. And then the light was coming, so they had to hide themselves, but they were gleeful, for they knew there would be no moon coming out that night, nor any other. Well, back in the village, the people waited for the moon to show in the sky. As they always did, they put a straw in their hats and a penny in their pocket against her coming, but the night stayed dark. And the next one, and the next one. And by, the things in the bog got so bold, they came right up into the village. And the people couldn't go out at night. And they had to keep their fires burning in their fireplaces all night long against the scratching and scraping at their doors and those faces that showed at their window. Well, they went to the old mill where the wise woman lived. And they said, how can we get the moon to come back? Well, she looked in her pot and her mirror and her book. She said, all I see is darkness. I can't help you, but you must keep your ears open, and if you hear anything at all, you must come and tell me. Well, it was young Davy that heard old Matthew talking about that night that he was in the bog, and all of a sudden there was a light from nowhere. And young Davy said, old Matty, could that have been the moon? And old Matty said, oh, yes, I reckon it was. So they went and they told the wise woman. And she looked again in her pot and her mirror and her book. And she said, I see a little glimmer, not much, but this is what you must do. You must all gather and you must go into the bog without speaking a word. You must put a pebble in your mouth and hold a hazel twig in your hand. And you must go into the bog and you must look for a coffin, a cross, and a candle. And if you find those things, I can't tell you for sure, but I think you might find the moon. And so the people gathered in the village, and first they said their prayers, but then they went to the edge of the bog. They put that pebble in their mouth, and they each held a hazel twig, and they held each other to make sure that no one was lost in the bog. And then they went into that dark place, and the mist curled up around their feet, and they smelled that heavy, wet air, and they heard the gurgling sounds all around them. But not only that, they heard the sounds of all those creatures pressing up against them, the moans and the shrieks of all the things that lived in the bogs and wanted them to stay. And they felt their wet, slimy hands plucking at their clothes. But they were brave. They were brave, and they went together looking for that coffin, that cross, and that candle. By and by, someone saw it, and she tapped the shoulder of the person in front of her, who tapped the arm of the person next to him, and they pointed, and they went to that place. There was that stone. It looked like a coffin, and the snag with its branches outstretched was like a cross, and the will-o'-the-wisp in the branches like a candle. Well, they lined up alongside that rock. They could see a slight silver glow along the edge of it. And they knew they were in the right place. And all of them silently reached down and got a handhold on that rock. And with one gesture, they lifted that rock and they flung it over. And then the light, it was so bright, they all had to close their eyes, except for young Davy. He kept his eyes open and swore to the end of his days he had seen the moon's shining face smiling down at all of them. And that moon shot right back up into the sky, and she shone so bright it was like noon in that place. And the people had brought her back again. Well, they do say that even to this day, even though the bogs have long been drained for farmland and houses, the moon shines brightest on that very village, on the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of all those people who were so brave and who restored her to her place in the sky.